began on a morning like any other, the kind of day that quietly reassured you nothing extraordinary could possibly happen. The small town of Ranipura, nestled between the folds of misty hills, was just waking up. The streets were bathed in soft golden light as the sun peeked through a thin layer of clouds, and the faint aroma of damp earth and blooming jasmine filled the air. Ranipura was a town where people still waved to their neighbors, and the echo of a bicycle bell was more common than the honk of a car horn. Life here moved slowly, like a leaf floating down the lazy river that snaked its way through the valley. Aniket Das, 27 years old, was no stranger to the comforting rhythm of this town. His days followed a quiet predictability that some might have called dull, but he found peace in its steadiness. His life revolved around a cozy one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a modest building overlooking the town square. The apartment was small but warm, cluttered with books stacked in uneven piles, a collection of dusty vinyl records, and a mismatched assortment of mugs he had accumulated over the years. The walls were adorned with faded posters from old sci-fi movies, their corners curling slightly from years of humid summers. Aniket worked as a video editor for a small content creation company that produced local advertisements and promotional videos. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and left him enough time to tinker with his passion projects, short films that he rarely shared with anyone. His mornings began with the ritual of brewing coffee, the sound of the grinder blending seamlessly with the faint hum of life outside. Today was no different. He stood by the window, sipping his first cup, watching as the shopkeepers below rolled up their shutters and arranged their displays. Downstairs, the faint chatter of his landlady, Mrs. Ghosh, carried up through the open window. She was a woman of indomitable spirit, perpetually wrapped in her floral saris, with a knack for knowing everything about everyone. She was currently scolding a delivery boy who had dropped a box of mangoes, her voice rising and falling like a well-rehearsed symphony. Aniket smiled faintly as he watched the boy apologize profusely, his hands gesturing in panicked defense. By mid-morning, Aniket was at his desk, headphones on, meticulously cutting footage for a tourism campaign featuring Ranipura's quaint charm. The video showcased the very streets he walked daily, the lush greenery of the hills, and the serene waters of the river. He adjusted the color grading, ensuring the golden hues of the sunset popped just right, and wondered, not for the first time, how something so ordinary to him could feel so magical through the lens of a camera. When lunch rolled around, Aniket made his way to his favorite eatery, a small, family-run restaurant just a block away. The air inside was thick with the scent of spices and frying dough. The owner's son, Deekila, was a cheerful young man who always greeted Aniket with a wide smile and a quick chat about football. Deekila was something of a local personality, known for his quirky online videos that often went viral within the close-knit community. He had an infectious energy, the kind that drew people in without them realizing it. Editing more of Ranipura's greatest hits, eh? Deekila teased as he placed a plate of steaming pakoras on the table. Aniket chuckled, shaking his head. "Someone has to make this town look interesting," he replied. They exchanged a few more jokes before Deekila was called back to the counter. The afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the town square as Aniket walked back to his apartment. The quiet buzz of his phone in his pocket broke the rhythm of his steps. It was a notification, a link to one of Deekila's latest videos. He saved it for later, thinking he might watch it while unwinding after work. For now, there were deadlines to meet and edits to finalize. As evening descended, the town square came alive with the soft glow of streetlights and the murmur of families out for a stroll. Aniket returned to his apartment, the faint strains of an old Bollywood song drifting up from Mrs. Ghosh's radio. He settled into his worn-out armchair, laptop on his knees, and clicked on the link to Deekila's video. The thumbnail showed Deekila grinning mischievously, his face illuminated by the bluish light of what seemed to be an old TV screen. The video began to play, but something about it felt off. Aniket paused it halfway through, not quite sure why he felt uneasy. He glanced out the window, the world outside bathed in a quiet calm. Shaking his head, he told himself he was being ridiculous. It was just another video, after all. He closed the laptop, stretched his arms, and let his gaze linger on the dimly lit town below. Tomorrow would be another ordinary day. Or so he thought. The night deepened, wrapping the town of Ranipura in its quiet embrace. The faint hum of cicadas filled the air, mingling with the distant clatter of dishes as families finished their evening meals. Aniket remained in his chair, the glow of the streetlights outside casting faint, flickering shadows across the walls of his apartment. His laptop sat closed on the coffee table, but his mind lingered on the video he had watched earlier. There was something about it, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't like Deekila to post something so peculiar. The video had started innocently enough. Deekila exploring an old, rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town, cracking jokes as usual. But there had been a moment, a brief, almost imperceptible shift, when the tone changed. It wasn't anything overt, just a flicker of the camera, a strange distortion in the audio, and a sudden silence from Deekila that had stretched uncomfortably long. Aniket shook his head, dismissing the thought. It was probably just a poorly edited attempt at something spooky, an experiment to keep his audience entertained. Deekila was always trying to outdo himself, after all. Still, the image of that warehouse lingered in Aniket's mind. He had recognized it, a crumbling structure on the edge of the forest, abandoned for years. Stories about it had circulated among the locals. Strange noises at night, lights flickering in the windows, and the occasional sighting of figures moving inside. But Aniket had never paid much attention to those tales. Ranipura was full of stories, most of them little more than superstitions. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the sound magnified by the stillness of the room. It was getting late. He stood up, stretching, and moved to the window. The square below was empty now, the shops closed, and the streets bathed in the soft silver of moonlight. A faint breeze rustled the trees, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly normal. But then, something caught his eye. Across the square, just beyond the fountain that marked the town center, stood a figure. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but the figure seemed to be facing his building, standing perfectly still. Aniket squinted, trying to discern more detail, but the distance and shadows obscured the features. He waited, expecting the person to move, to walk away, but they remained motionless. The longer he stared, the more uneasy he felt. He reached for his phone, intending to call someone, perhaps the local police station, just to report it. But then, as if sensing his intent, the figure turned. It wasn't a normal turn, though. The motion was sharp, almost mechanical, like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. And then it began to walk, moving slowly but deliberately, disappearing into the narrow alley beside the bakery. Aniket's hand froze, his phone halfway to his ear. He hesitated, torn between the urge to investigate and the logical voice in his head telling him to let it go. It was probably nothing. A drunk, a stray visitor, someone wandering home late. But the memory of the video resurfaced, unbidden. The warehouse, the flickering light, the strange silence. Against his better judgment, Aniket found himself slipping on his shoes and grabbing his keys. The quiet hallway outside his apartment seemed longer than usual as he made his way down to the ground floor. Mrs. Gauch's radio had gone silent, and the building felt eerily still. When he stepped outside, the night air was cool against his skin, carrying with it the faint scent of wet grass. The square was empty, just as it had been from his window. He walked cautiously to the spot where the figure had stood, his footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. There was nothing, no sign of anyone. He turned toward the alley where the figure had disappeared, his heartbeat quickening. The alley was darker than he remembered, the shadows seeming to stretch unnaturally. He hesitated at the entrance, peering into the void. For a long moment, he considered turning back, retreating to the safety of his apartment, and brushing the whole thing off as an overactive imagination. But then, from somewhere deep within the alley, he heard it. A sound so faint, he almost thought he had imagined it. A voice, familiar, distorted. Aniket. His name, spoken in a low, drawn-out whisper that sent a chill crawling up his spine. He froze, his breath hitching in his chest. It was impossible. The voice sounded like Deekila's, but it was warped, layered with something else. A deeper, guttural undertone that didn't belong. Aniket took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. But as he turned, he caught sight of something glinting on the ground near his feet. A phone. He bent down, picking it up with trembling hands. The screen lit up as he touched it, displaying a paused video, the very same one he had watched earlier that evening. Only this time, the time star